Princes and Priests. Chapter 5. The Baron's Guest. Even as the villagers worked to put out the fires and repair the night's damage, the knights led the company from the small cluster of homes. The 3 knights who carried the children rode on ahead to the barony, while 2 others led their horses and walked with the travelers. The knights were poorly geared, their horses more farm beast than war horse, and their clothes little better, but they were friendly and happy to talk about their troubles, dealing with the goblins and other creatures in the area. Theo talked with them comfortably, and as if they were truly knights worthy of such a title. They seemed to like him rather well, and were content to talk with just him. That was something all the others were grateful for. They headed up another ridge, challenging the snow and cold at this higher elevation. They didn't follow a road at all, but hiked through the forest with only the knowledge that their guides had of the area. Storytelling dropped off as the hike grew more difficult. The wind seemed to steal the breath away, and the cold was enough to keep everyone focused on their feet and hands. At the top of the ridge, they sheltered inside a large but shallow cave to warm up and rest a bit. Oirion eased back against the stone wall, his joints aching from the weather and altitude. He was not used to this. If Jamie were here, he would be close, sharing a shield of warmth and laying a hand on the aches to melt them away. Oirion closed his eyes and tried to not think about life without the only friend he had in the world. Unable to escape his thoughts and grief, he focused on the group that was with him now. Not in 30 years or more had he dealt with this many people for so long a time. It was an odd sort of change. He had forgotten all about the night's highlights in the backyard until he saw Cindy. She smiled at him, a different sort of smile than she had given him before. She bit the tip of her finger, dropping her eyes a little to look up at him. He was so shocked at her open flirt that he didn't even know what to think. His brain just stopped. She laughed at him and ran the tip of her tongue over her lips. He was trying to think how to react to that sort of boldness when Raven suggested they keep moving. They began heading down into the next valley. Oirion was upset about his utter lack of reprimand, and worse, the reaction his body had for the suggestions she had made. He wasn't able to think of anything else. At least he wasn't thinking about Jamie and what would wait for him back in Pert. They hiked the rest of the day before reaching a small rutted road. The shortcut paid off when the walled complex came into sight. As they approached the manor, the sun went below the mountains, leaving them in an early false dusk. They were cold and tired, but picked up the pace to get to the walls as fast as they could. Walls were something not often seen in any of the cities or villages that were built over the past 500 years anywhere else. These walls were tall and made of thickly mortared stones, indicating a preparation for attacks. Such effort would not be spent without good reason. In his youth, Shannon had fought and trained against and within many walled structures. He could see right away that the wall would only work against the most crude sort of wars. Any serious attacker with enough men or horses could easily pull the wall down. The gate was weak and wider than necessary. The battlements were low and, like the gate, too widely spaced. The walls had handholds across the entire surface and would be easy to climb for just about anything with fingers. No one said anything as they entered the complex and escaped the wind. Out of the wind, the reek of the place hit them at once. The waste of the people was dumped out into open gutters, and the place stank of disease. Shannon noticed Raven's distaste as Raven muttered something in Dwarven about it. Dwarves were a very clean race, and this place was surely revolting to him. It would be as revolting to him as laying rotting corpses in the streets would be to the humans in this company, except Ivan, perhaps. Shannon wasn't sure if Ivan would care about even such a situation as that. The man was as emotionally detached as any person Shannon had ever met. It was like he had shut off all connection to his own heart cores. If nothing else, it made being around him easier, even if his stories and endless performance of greed and bravado were an annoyance. They moved up the street, if you could call it that, to the manor in the center. The manor looked as if it had once been a barn or warehouse that had been converted to suit the name placed on it. The overall shape was a plain rectangle with a second and third floor. Additions had been built onto it, all of different sizes and peak angles. Some of the additions had windows, but those were open without glass or screen. The yard was unkempt with neither gravel nor grass, but covered in the mud of the area, sticky and red. There were several weary-looking horses in the yard and a collection of farm birds, damp and miserable-looking. They scratched at the mud, attempting to find something worth pecking at. A lanky gray pig was napping on the front step. A dozen piglets squealed over which ones got to lay on the step and nurse. For once, everyone had the same sentiment as Cindy as she made a sound of disgust. Kelly, though, seemed remarkably unoffended by the state of the place. She followed the guide without comment. He handed the horse off to the other and stepped up to the door to knock. The man wrapped a heavy ring that hung on the center of the stout, weather-beaten door. It wasn't long before an elderly woman opened the old door for them. She pulled it wide and let them inside without a word, bowing as they passed her. She seemed to be expecting them. The silent big man who served as a guide took them through a labyrinth of dark, narrow halls and small chambers. They went into a larger room, thick with the smoke of the fire in the hearth. The torches on the walls also let off their own stinking black smoke, making for a haze that stank and stuck to the teeth. The lord of the manor stood up sharply from his meal. He was a gaunt man in his late 50s. His gray hair was carefully combed and his clothes were embroidered in bright designs. The color drained from his face when he saw them. They obviously were not who he was expecting. Shannon noticed the man's dismay, but what caught his eye was the scroll case on the table and the book beside it. He had seen both before. While he couldn't place where just at the moment, it gave him the definite feeling that they needed to be on their way as soon as possible. The fact that the items seemed so familiar was disturbing in itself, but more so was the idea that the Baron was expecting important company other than them. It was of instant concern, and Shannon was ready to leave immediately. His plan to let them rest, and even leave those who wanted to stay, had changed. No one would be staying. He had spent too much time with them, and with the right magics, he could be tracked via any of the company. No, he had to keep them together for now. If the man dared to refuse Shannon anything, Shannon would take steps, any steps that were necessary. Even as Shannon made up his mind, both of the holy men grabbed for swords that they no longer had. Their hands closed over empty air. They were trained to recognize bloods, and were sworn to destroy them as swiftly as any evil creature. At least the two priests could tell the Baron was a blood, a fact that did not redeem the disappointment Shannon had of them for not sensing the circle the other night, but at least they weren't utterly devoid of their training. Shannon glanced at them and put a hand out to stop them from moving forward. He would argue with them later, but first he had to get a handle on the Baron. The Baron looked at them, a bit scared and nervous, and then his eyes settled on Shannon as Shannon's magics caught and held his attention.
These people aided the villagers in the fight with the Hobbs. They got your grandson back. Charlene felt they deserved a reward,
their guide said softly.
Of course, yes. What can I get for you?
He asked in a deep, rich voice. He cleared his throat, still unable to take his eyes off Shannon.
We need food, baths, new clothes, and weapons. I also require detailed maps of the area,
Shannon said. The Baron motioned to the table.
Please sit. Be welcome. I will see to the food, baths, and clothes myself.
He left them alone, taking the night out of the room with him, using a curt gesture.
What do you think you're doing?
Oirion demanded of Shannon in a harsh whisper.
We cannot eat here. We cannot sleep here.
Then do not eat,
Shannon said coldly.
But let the others eat.
He picked up the book, an old book that had a complex lock on it. It was not something that this weak-minded Baron could possibly hope to open, so he had to have a master to whom the book belonged. Setting the old, worn leather book down, he picked up the scroll case. He suddenly recognized the energy in it all too well. He nearly dropped it. Good God, it was his. How in the hells had it gotten here? It had been thousands of years since it had last been seen. How had it gotten to this man, in this place, and why? The only person who was still alive and would be keyed into it was Jerome. Only Jerome. Shannon set the case down carefully, trying to hide that he was shaky. Energy prickled the skin of his face, and his hand hurt painfully as he rubbed at the old scar. His entire body felt too hot and ached. His shields burned and vibrated, warning. He should not be here.
How can you deal with him? He's a blood. I'm sworn to kill him.
Oirion said, roughly turning Shannon by the shoulder to face him. They stood toe to toe. The insignificant Baron was the least of Orion's problems just now, even if he didn't know it. Shannon would have put him in his place, but he had his mind on other things.
Not tonight.
Shannon said, grabbing Orion's arm as the priest turned to follow the blood.
If you want to kill him, fine, but not today, and not as long as we are all here. You want this whole village chasing us? Sit down and eat. Put your morals to bed.
His patience was wearing thin. He needed to think, and having Oirion on a crusade wasn't going to help anyone right now. Another time and place, Shannon would have encouraged Oirion to deal with the idiot. After all, as a hunter on the border of Norwood, that was the priest's job. Even though Oirion didn't know, he had performed that service many times for Shannon before. But right now, Shannon needed Oirion to calm down and to get some space between them and this barony.
You're defending him,
Oirion accused, almost in shock.
Shannon's right.
Raven said softly.
We need to eat to get supplies and weapons. I don't like it, but for the lives of the others.
He said pointedly, but didn't finish. There was no need to.
You and I can come back after we leave. You'll surely return with us to eradicate the evil here?
The dwarf's meaning was clear. He wanted Shannon to come back and prove his loyalty to the group and not to some brotherhood of bloods. Shannon nodded slightly.
Of course, brother. I would be more than willing to remove the Baron.
He pushed Oirion out of his way as he let go of his arm. He needed to get some space between him and those two. The short contact with Orion's arm was enough to make his head start buzzing and his chest constrict. What was left of his heart had stopped even trying to beat. He took a piece of bread out of a basket on his way to the window. The others fell upon the mutton, puddings, and gravy. The greasy richness of the meal appealed to all of them, except Shannon. Where had that scroll case been last? Had Jerome taken it from the palace in Norwood, or had it been with his things in Ulambach? He hadn't thought about it in so long. He was a little surprised that he even recognized it. How it had gotten here, and why, was more important than where it had been. It couldn't have been chance that it was here, where he was, at this moment. He knew even before the storm had hit them and had driven them so far off course that it was Jerome's doing. The magic of the Great Barrier had been his to learn, but he simply did not know it well enough. Everything had been cut short. He could not explain how they survived the passage, how the case could be here, or why Jerome was involved with either. Shannon turned from the window, refusing to let questions he couldn't answer drive him crazy. He looked at the thing on the table, debating if he would take it back or leave it. Better to deny that he had been here. He would leave it. He wanted nothing that could tie him to Jerome, and that scroll case most certainly could. Oirion waited in the doorway of the room that the men were sharing. The bath and meal had helped, but he was still rebelling against being here and not killing the blood. It was evil men like that who had turned Jamie. Every part of him wanted to hunt the Baron down and rip him apart. In the hallway, Shannon came around the corner from the bathroom. He looked little different from the bath, though his hair was still damp and unbraided. The Baron appeared, jumping out of a side doorway in front of Shannon. He bowed, breathless, wiping his bony hands on his tunic front.
My lord,
he said, all but panting.
Is all satisfactory?
It serves.
Shannon said simply, not slowing for him.
Is there anything else that I can do to please you better?
I require pack ponies and supplies, as well as weapons for all my people. We do have some trade.
Of course, but your lordship does not need to leave. I'd be honored to have you grace my house.
No, my companions and I must be leaving. Today.
I beg you, sire, stay.
He pleaded rather earnestly.
I expect you to personally see to the packs, Baron, and I will remember you by how well they are seen to.
The man bowed deeply.
Of course. Forgive me for wishing to keep you. grand hunters such as yourselves must be in great demand.
Good day, Baron,
Shannon said, dismissing the Baron to his task, and continuing up the hall to where Oirion waited. The Baron's graciousness was forced, but full of desperation. Shannon was certain they had to leave, and soon. Somehow his lure had not held, and that meant the Baron was protected by very powerful magics, most likely by Jerome himself.
What the hell was that about?
Oirion demanded as Shannon entered the room.
You have your magic, I have mine,
Shannon said. Raven looked up from where he sat picking at his beard. Shannon had refused the long robes that seemed to be the style of the men here. It looked suitably dramatic and noble on Dave, he noticed. It was not so flattering on Even, making him look clumsy and somewhat like an ugly bearded woman.
He's a blood and he's fawning all over you, sire.
Oirion spat the last word, throwing it in Shannon's face.
He recognized you. He fears you,
Raven added, sticking up for Orion's bold challenge of Shannon, more out of curiosity than moral debate. Shannon knew, but it was irritating.
So do you.
Shannon turned his cold blue eyes on Raven. The dwarf had to fight hard to not shiver. Shannon smiled slightly. The dwarf was so much more than he let on. He was so much more than even he knew. It was almost fun to poke at him, but now was not the time.
You would deal with bloods,
Oirion demanded, taking the focus off Raven to Ravan's great relief.
So will you, if you hope to live.
Shannon returned his focus to Oirion, his voice getting an edge to it.
I don't think that you understand the importance of the situation. That man is a blood. He's no longer human. He's a monster. He is soulless.
Don't preach at me, priest,
Shannon snapped. He was angrier than he should have been. There was nothing that Oirion had said that was even remotely worth getting upset over. There was no reason for him to lose his temper at Oirion, but he was beginning to. Between the scroll case and the events of the last few days, he was off-center and his shields dangerously damaged. He could still taste the wild tang of the Orcan woman in his mouth. He could feel the stink and vile of the goblin's cave on him. And now Jerome had crept up into the forefront of his thoughts. Even so, what Oirion was saying was nothing Shannon hadn't felt or said at one time himself. Oirion was trained to react and move as he did. Shannon knew that, and was further annoyed at his emotional involvement and how easily Oirion could get to him. He focused on his shields, tightening them a little, blocking out the burning temptation that was Orion's nearness. He wanted to shout at Oirion to just leave him alone, but he only clenched his teeth.
You're defending him again,
Oirion argued. Shannon forced himself to turn away from the priest and sat down on the bed. He sent his own anger into his shields and forced himself to consciously breathe, steady and slow.
I will do what I need to, in order to keep the others alive. If that means that I play mind games with the local lords, then I will, and you will back me. You do not have to like it, but if your rash temper gets those people killed, their blood is on your hands, Oirion. You have no choice.
He made himself speak as softly as he could and not show how upset he was getting.
There is always a choice,
Oirion insisted. His strength was unexpected, and the other men were slightly impressed by it, as was Shannon, but he was even more irritated by it. Dave got up. An accent was whispering into Shannon's words, proving that he was getting rather upset at the man who was challenging him. Dave had seen Shannon kill men for a lot less. Shannon heard it himself and understood that Dave was hearing it as well.
The lines are not always so exact,
Shannon said firmly.
There is more to the world than just black and white. There is not the right or wrong that your church would have you believe.
He needed Oirion to back down.
What would a man like you know about the Holy Church?
Oirion challenged, trying to antagonize him. It hit Shannon wrong. He stood sharply, but Dave jumped in front of him. The young man put his hands on Shannon's chest, blocking access to Oirion with his body. Shannon used the cool touch, the gentleness of his great-nephew, to keep control. He focused on Dave and used the young man's shields like cover.
More than you think,
he said in a cold voice over Dave's shoulder.
We need food, weapons and money. I will see that we get it by whatever means necessary, and it should not matter to you how I do it.
He dared not meet Dave's eyes, not yet.
It does matter,
Oirion said.
I have sworn to kill all bloods.
Do it on your own time. You endanger everyone with your personal crusade. Keep it up, Oirion, and I will hand you over to the first real blood that I find. I hear the blood of a wizard priest is highly valued.
What sort of man would even suggest that, or are you a man at all?
Oirion asked, covering his shock with a hateful remark. Shannon's cheek twitched as he clenched his teeth. Anyone else would have died very slowly for that remark, finding out personally just what in hell Shannon was. Shannon could feel Dave trying to help, trying to make it easier, and he was. Shannon allowed the soft touch to keep him in place.
We needed shelter. I got us shelter. We needed clothes, so I got us new clothes. We needed food, so I saw that we were fed. We need weapons, and I have seen to it that we will get them. You might not like the way I do it, but so long as you use the shelter, eat the food, wear those clothes, or you are defended by the weapons, you have no right to lecture me.
Shannon saw Raven narrow his eyes, trying to see beyond the surface, and to look at Shannon on a deeper level while he was seemingly distracted by Oirion. The dwarf would see nothing more with sight than his naked eyes could see. Shifting his powers from a mere look to a touch, Raven went to poke through Shannon's shields. His light tap on Shannon's shield was doubled and tripled, and then reflected back at him. It hit him so hard and fast that he grunted and lost his breath, nearly toppling back off the stool he was sitting on. Shannon did not even have to look away from Oirion. These two were no challenge for him, and the fact he wasted effort to even talk to them made him resent them both. He vaguely hoped Raven had cracked a rib or two.
Here and now is not the time or place for moral debate,
Dave said softly, almost pleading.
We need each other, and the women need us even more.
He met Shannon's eyes, his fear evident, but testing the promise Shannon had made to him as a child that he'd never hurt him. He looked back over his shoulder.
Shannon said that he would return with you to deal with the blood, if that's the problem. If it's something else, then it can wait until no one else is involved.
This will be settled, Shannon.
Oirion said coldly, but he stepped back.
If it were just you and me.
But it is not.
Shannon said firmly, proud of Dave, but still angry at Oirion. Oirion grunted and turned from him. Dave waited until he felt Shannon relax a measure, and then stepped back, actually shaking a little. He looked up nervously for Shannon's reaction to his bold intervention.
We do need you, don't we?
Dave asked in a whisper, his voice almost failing him. Like all of Dave's questions to Shannon, it meant much more. He wanted to know if this place was so dangerous as to require Shannon's power to stay alive.
The priests maybe not,
Shannon said softly.
but the rest of you do.
He understood Dave's questions. He always had, and Dave usually understood the answers.
What do we do?
Dave asked. But the real question was, were they ever going to be able to go home? Shannon gave his nephew what comfort he could.
One thing at a time, David.
He let it go at that, grateful for the young man. Shannon was not sure how long he could deal with Oirion. It was bad enough to run into the man at all, and now to have to face him without respite was a constant attack that he was not sure he was capable of dealing with. Dave was a needed buffer.
My question is, do we really have to go?
Theo asked no one in particular.
Yes,
Raven said it.
there is something very wrong here.
Isn't it your job to fix it then?
Ivan asked smugly, followed by a cheerful quirk of a smile.
Not at the expense of the lives of the common man.
Revan said calmly.
If it was just Oirion and me, we would stay and cleanse this area, but there are others to consider.
Raven smirked back at the big man.
If the people knew he was a blood, they might be grateful for a better lord, and we might be welcome and give them all a better life.
Theo said.
The sooner we leave, the better.
Raven said with a finality that ended the conversation. Shannon was glad that Raven felt the same way and had taken up the explanations. If he had made the same argument, Oirion would have fought him, and it would have likely divided the group. That would lead to the near certain deaths of most of them. Not that he should care, he reminded himself, and turned to the window to work on shielding and repairing the damage of the last few nights. They didn't have long to wait before clean clothes and their sizes were brought out. The woman was young, her face was gray, and her eyes were cast down, She set down the basket, and without a word, dashed out as fast as she could. Despite how Ivan felt about wearing peasant clothes, he dropped off his robes and pulled on the new clothes, with no remark this time. They were neither damaged nor dirty, and he needed them. They were a bit small, but surprisingly, they fit him well enough. He imagined they came from some great blacksmith. Shannon alone kept his old clothes. No woolen fabric would do. He simply folded the extra set and put it aside to be taken.
How much are we trading for this?
Dave asked as he laced up the front of the woolen tunic.
Too much.
Raven grumbled, rolling up the pant legs.
Not much.
Shannon said. He pointed to the pile of Ivan's things and shook his head. Ivan looked at the purtan a moment, almost spoke, then began to pick out his jewelry, knives, and trinkets, replacing them on his body.
Ivan keeps his jewelry, but Cindy loses her silk.
Theo asked, watching the big man buckle up his studded belt.
Maybe being sparkly is a bad idea when we are in the wild places, you know.
Cindy's silk is a vanity without meaning,
Dave said with a shrug as he dropped back into his chair.
Ivan's things he earned with sweat and blood, and besides, they're worth far more than a basket full of coarse wool and thin threaded leather gear. Look at this stuff. Any strain and the seams will burst.
Ivan gave Dave an odd look for a moment, and then grinned.
Well, how about the weapons you suggested we might get?
He asked Shannon. After a short wait, the Baron showed up. He then personally led them to a small but full armory. The women arrived from the other direction, dressed in the same gear as the men.
Practical,
Dave said, pointing at the clothing they wore. Kelly grunted.
Sorry it took us so long to get here,
Tavia said.
They thought to give us dresses.
Kelly objected to the dresses.
Cindy huffed.
She even made me give back the one for me.
She caught Theo's arm, making a little pout face. Dave muttered something and then followed Shannon into the armory. He could see at once that the weapons were not of the quality that he would have liked, but they were better than nothing. In the doorway, both Ivan and Kelly lit up. They eagerly went forward to find what they thought they needed.
Help yourselves. Please take whatever you need,
the Baron said. Shannon motioned the others into the room. Oirion was about to object, but Raven moved him along with a grunt and a shove.
Theo.
Dave handed the blonde nobleman a basic sword. It was plain with a simple hilt, but light, well-balanced, and strong. It had a double edge and sharp tip, versatile and easy to learn.
I'd rather not,
Theo said, backing away a little uneasily.
Take it. You'll be glad of it. I can teach you to use it if you like,
Dave said. Theo took it reluctantly, almost as if it was going to bite him, more out of the hope to make a friend than to have the weapon. Dave took one very similar but larger for himself and picked out a few hunting knives, tossing one to Theo.
David, Theo.
Shannon motioned them over to the racks where he stood, picking out armors for them. Dave led the slim man over to Shannon.
Hold his hair up, Theo,
Shannon said, taking Dave's belt and new weapons. Setting aside his new weapons, Theo gathered up Dave's long sandy hair a bit nervously. Shannon took a coat of mail and helped Dave into it, hooking up the front of the armor. He handed Dave a heavy leather tunic and then buckled on the sword belt and hunting daggers. Adjusting the new gear, Shannon inspected him and nodded. Taking another chain shirt off the rod, he motioned Theo over.
I don't want to,
Theo objected. Dave pushed him over. Suddenly, Theo couldn't breathe. Shannon terrified him, and it didn't help that every time he got emotional, his lungs tended to fail. He struggled to master his body, his breath wheezing loudly.
What's wrong with you now?
Ivan demanded.
He has weak lungs.
Cindy dashed over, trying to comfort him, but only got in the way. Shannon pushed her back with an annoyed look. He grabbed Theo by the shoulders and turned him around to face him. The tall man took hold of the wheezing Owens man by the throat, and almost immediately Theo could breathe. Breathing still hurt, but it wasn't as impossible as it had been before.
David, hold up his hair,
Shannon said, as if nothing at all had happened. Dave did, and Shannon edged the old iron mail up Theo's arms and onto his shoulders. When it was on, the weight was too much. Theo almost hit the floor. Shannon hooked up the front and then handed the sword back to him.
You're a brute,
Cindy gasped at Shannon. She pouted over Theo, making him feel embarrassed and far from being a man.
Don't you know he can't wear that? He's too weak.
Theo hated her for saying that, and they all saw it in his eyes.
David, get her into something that offers a little protection.
Shannon turned from the young woman as if she hadn't said anything at all. She huffed, stomping her little foot. Ivan and Kelly were loading on as much as they could carry. Their greed exceeded their reason, but Shannon let them. As weak as the blades were, they would break and need replacements along the way. Let them use their strength to carry a supply station if they wanted. Tavia had put on a hunter's vest and was testing out the slender bows of the people here. Shannon went to Travis, picked the boy up, and put him on the table. He, as well as the others, needed to be armed and protected a little. An adolescent hunting vest fit Travis like a long tunic. The tooled leather would protect him better than nothing. Shannon strapped a knife on the boy and strung a wallet across his chest. Shannon pulled a few feathers from an arrow and put them in the wallet, something for Travis's fingers to play with, at least to keep them off the knife until Dave taught the boy to use it. Shannon looked around for a weapon he could use. He watched as Theo picked a bow and quiver off of the wall with an almost guilty look. No one but Shannon seemed to even notice. Shannon looked down at the slight blond man and took a bow off the wall for himself, as well as a quiver for one hip and a sword for the other. Theo gave him a wary smile and stepped away, but kept hold of his chosen weapon. Shannon scanned the group, was satisfied, and led the way out. The sun was still well up in the sky. They could get a good ways before dark. A sense of urgency was building, and he wanted to be on the way so badly that he felt ready to take off at a run. 5 hairy, abused-looking, gray and white ponies waited in the yard, loaded with large packs. The packs were full, but were made of worn leather that looked ready to rip apart. Shannon doubted that the supplies inside were any better, hardly worth the silk of Cindy's dress that was traded for it all. The Baron watched them, nervously shifting his weight. He wanted to talk to Shannon, but he had nothing to say to the man. Kelly took the lead rope of the ponies, and they left the village without any goodbyes or looking back. Once on the road, they picked up the pace and headed south on an only slightly better road than the one they had come in on. Oirion took the lead. He wanted to get away from the village, and Raven was keeping pace in the middle. Shannon didn't object. He needed time, his shields needed work, and the farther away from Oirion and Raven he could get, the better. The back of the line, with the greatest possible distance between them, was the best place in this situation. He tried to push the thought of his scroll case out of his mind and focus on one problem at a time. He had shields to build, energy to purge, and this unplanned side trip was getting worse by the day. There was a lot more going on than just another random attack to make his life more difficult. The shipwreck alone might have been bad enough, but one thing after another was being aimed at him, and he knew it. They needed to get away from this place as fast as possible. They had stayed on the beach far too long, and now they were going to have a hard time making up for it. They hadn't gone far, just a few miles, when Oirion suddenly pulled them aside. He had spotted a clearing just off the road. He turned to Raven.
I think that we need to decide what we're going to do. We can't just wander around for the rest of our lives.
It was obvious that he was more concerned with getting too far away to make it feasible to turn back and go after the Baron. Let Shannon try to play his games. Oirion was not about to allow it so easily. He knew Shannon's skills were needed to keep all these people alive, but there was something that needed to be done first. Then they needed to get these people out of here.
Why not just stay at the village? I mean, the Baron seemed to like us enough,
Cindy said, taking on a motherly tone, trying to sound adult.
That's not an option,
Raven said.
There are 2 things we can do. One is to split up and seek our lives in the populace, hoping we don't break any cultural laws, or we could find a place together and work toward making a good life for each other.
Everyone looked around at that. Did they like each other that much? Did they dare break up?
Or we could go into the cities and find work there and still stay together,
Even said, for once sounding like he had some measure of a brain inside that stubbly head.
Once we split, we're split. If we stick together, we can always split up later when we know this place a little better.
Theo offered, agreeing with Ivan, displaying an obvious grimace.
So what do we do?
Tavia said.
We don't have the money to buy a place, and I doubt that we'll stumble onto an abandoned place that is big enough and in good enough condition to have ready by winter.
We could go to the local lord.
Cindy suggested brightly.
Explain the situation and tell him that we are really all nobles. Surely he'd let us stay with him.
I wonder if there are any slavers.
Theo mused.
Cindy would fetch a good price, I'm sure.
He said, looking critically at her. Kelly had to turn away to hide a smile. Dave caught it and almost laughed. Cindy just tossed her hair with a snort at the comment.
You met the local lord,
Shannon told her softly.
I was not very impressed with him, or his house.
Surely there are real nobles around here. That man was just a poor baron,
She said, sounding almost scared that there weren't real nobles around to save her.
Is there any place that is marked on the map that he gave you?
Raven asked Shannon.
No.
Nothing?
Oirion insisted.
Abandoned places are not commonly put on maps.
Shannon pointed out to Oirion, who had picked up a habit of challenging everything he said. That was going to get old really fast.
Let's look.
Oirion pressed. Shannon took out the map that the Baron had given him. He rolled it out, using a touch of power at each corner to hold it flat. Both Raven and Oirion were trained to hunt blood magic. He'd rather not have to deal with their training right now, but he wanted them to know that he was in control of his power, not just under a shield of someone else's making. The map was old, and the language used was an old form of the continental language, not the common language that all humans and most other races spoke. No one here, except for Shannon, was going to be able to read it. The names were rather simple and uncreative, but told what the areas were like. He hoped not, but he was sure the names were earned. There were places called the Forest of the Damned and Deathwood. There was the Bog and the Fire Swamp. The grass that they had just passed through was nicely named the Grassland. He suspected that all the names were mildly put, understatements that were very descriptive if you knew the place.
I can't read that.
Oirion grunted.
It does little good.
It does not say much,
Shannon said.
and it does not say anywhere. This is a nice, abandoned castle. Move on in.
Oirion gave Shannon a withering look.
I can find a place.
Dave said, trying not to smile at Shannon's humor.
If that is what we want to do.
Dave knew that Shannon could easily find what they needed, but for some reason, the man wasn't going to do that. Whatever that reason was, Dave was going to trust that it was a good one, and so nervously volunteered.
Anyone object?
Raven asked. No one did.
Let's get off the road and up into the trees.
Raven said to Oirion.
We can go back and see to the Baron's religious state, while the others rest, and Dave does his thing.
They climbed up the mountain for several hours, and then set up a small camp. The three leaders headed back down the mountain at once. Dave walked just outside the camp, sat on the ground, and relaxed. Shannon had taught him long ago how to look for things magically, how to lift out of your body and seek out whatever it was you were looking for. It was just another application of the same sight that he used to view the grass. It might take a while, but he would find something that would work. Surprisingly, no one even asked how he was going to do it. The three reached the village at dusk, ducking in just before the gates were closed, taking care to not be seen. They didn't really have to do much to hide from the villagers, but the hunter and the cleric were too well trained to be lax, even though it seemed safe. In the backyard of the manor, they tested the kitchen door and found it still unlocked. Slipping in, Raven shook his head at the untidiness of the room, questioning the safety of the food they had eaten.
I'll check the front hall,
Oirion said softly, not even noticing. He scowled at Shannon, who was rubbing his left hand. Shannon hadn't even realized he was doing it, with all the other things on his mind. But when Oirion noticed, Shannon jerked his right hand away, flexing his left, daring the man to say anything. Oirion almost did, but Raven opened the door to the hallways.
I've got his room,
Raven said, and turned toward the stairs. Shannon headed to the library. He was after something else. He wanted that book, or at least to find out what was so important to be so strongly locked, here, not in some Perton library. Raven followed the hallway up to the stairs, and then scanned to find the blood. A light scan was all he needed to reach the fellow. It was as if the Baron's power had amplified 100 times. He wondered if the Baron had known they were priests and had hidden his power and corruption somehow. Raven found the man on the 3rd floor, in an area that was surely once a hayloft. It was a large, rather lavishly decorated room, filled with a wealth that he certainly hadn't shown to them. Perhaps the Baron was not as hospitable as he had seemed. The room was draped in red silk, with large velvet-cushioned chairs. Gold caught the glow of a mage lamplight and glimmered down from gold chains over the room. Rugs covered the stone floors. The walls were whitewashed and covered with tapestries of great battles. He almost moved into the room, but the Baron wasn't alone. Raven ducked into the long folds of a velvet drape at the side of the door. He carefully pulled back a bit of new, stiff velvet. It still smelled of the dyes used to get the red color. This wealth was new, and that immediately did not bode well with the dwarf. Wealth like this was not gained by such men for good reasons or with good motives. He could see the Baron, but that wasn't all he saw. His heart stopped in his chest when he saw the one man that he had thought was without sin, but there he was. Why was he here? What was going on? Was Raven mistaken? He reeled at the shock of it and cringed back into his hiding place. The Holy Pontiff stood in the room with the Baron. Raven closed his eyes and focused on breathing, trying to keep calm and not jump to conclusions.
Where did they go?
The Pontiff asked the trembling Baron.
I don't know, Eminence. Please, believe me.
Are you positive that there were 2 priests with him?
Yes, Oirion and Raven. I told you all this.
Are you positive that the man's name was Oirion?
Yes, they all called him that.
How disappointing,
the Pontiff sighed.
We always have such high hopes for our children, and yet they let us down time and again. Such is life. He disobeyed orders. He was to stay in Norwood, and now he will have to pay the price for his disobedience.
Your son, Holy...
The Pontiff gestured vaguely.
I comfort those on death row as I can. Sometimes it even postpones one's demise for a while, 9 months or so anyway.
He chuckled softly at some fond memory.
But he is of no moment. I can always have more if the desire ever suits me again. You mentioned that there was a young blonde man in the group.
He didn't speak and they didn't catch his name. Teo, maybe, or something like that.
Yes, well, it is the other one, the Perton, that interests me.
He is powerful.
Yes, I know. He and I go way back. Honestly, the first man that I ever loved. Another disappointment,
the Pontiff added bitterly.
He was too attached to that wife of his. I warned him and he paid, as will Oirion. I don't take disappointment well.
The man smiled slightly.
Where did they go again?
I don't know.
The Baron was almost in tears.
Oh, do think. I only have so long before I have to go back to the real world. My little hunting game is on a timetable.
Raven was in shock. The Pontiff was insane. Had he lost his mind when he went through the shield? Then Raven's sharp ears heard a man approaching from up the hall. The man smelled so strongly of blood that it made Raven gag. He knew that the foul taste and gut-wrenching sensation of it would surely jar the Pontiff back to himself. He himself was barely keeping from being sick. Surely the Pontiff would suffer just as bad, if not worse. How had the people here kept this vileness hidden from them?
From the mind of an old server woman,
the blood was saying, as Raven listened again, focusing through the overwhelming nausea.
And?
The Pontiff asked impatiently.
They headed south. The priest was in the lead. The Perton followed up last. If he is Tyredell, he doesn't seem to be the leader of the group, and I can't imagine the King of Norwood taking seconds to anyone.
It's him, all right. I'd be able to taste my old partner anywhere. You don't have a man inside your soul and not feel his presence. South, you say?
The chuckling madness of earlier was gone now, and the man was the serious man that Raven had seen on the Holy Throne 1,000 times. Raven answered to only one other, but usually to him. He had often knelt reverently at the Pontiff's feet. The idea that there was deception made him feel cold, dwarven anger. Wasn't his faith tested enough?
We'll wait until morning. It should prove an interesting hunt. I went to a lot of work to set this up.
The pontiff chuckled.
I've waited thousands of years for this.
The men wonder what your orders are about the others.
The 2 priests are for you personally to do what you wish with?
Thank you.
The blood bowed deeply.
Indeed, both are royal blood, so enjoy them. As for the others, they are for the men. All except for the Purton, he is for me. But we will do whatever it takes to capture and secure him. If that requires a broken bone or a few, that is quite acceptable,
he said pleasantly.
Perhaps we should head out now. Surely he will feel you, as you feel him.
I don't think so. Not after what the demons did to him. They are very good at what they do. Did any of the group seem to suspect who he was?
Not as far as I could tell. As I said, he seems to have little, if any, authority in the group.
He was ever humble,
the pontiff recalled, putting his hand on his chest with a sigh. He laughed softly again.
That will make the hunt easier, if nothing else. I always told him his humility would be his downfall.
Raven turned, half blind, and slipped out of the room. With only thoughts of escape, he fled down the hall. On the stairs, he nearly ran into Oirion coming up.
We need to go now. He has allies with him,
Raven said. Not even waiting for the other man to follow, he ran down the rest of the stairs to the hallways below, sick to his stomach and his mind whirling in horror. He needed fresh air. He needed to breathe. The pontiff was mad. He was going mad. That had to be it. Oirion hesitated and then followed Raven back outside. There was fear in the cleric, and if that was true, the priest had not the arrogance to assume that he would fare better. In the yard, they waited for Shannon. It wasn't long before the man came out.
Let's go,
Raven said.
We need to get far from here, and fast.
Shannon didn't object. He nodded and let the dwarf take the lead. The others were not at all happy that Raven made them get up and move, but he left them no choice. They headed out at once, deeper into the mountains, due west, any direction but south.
Raven?
Dave said, joining the dwarf in the front.
I found a place. It's some distance, but it'll work well, I think.
Can you lead us there?
Raven asked, knowing that he should ask how the young man had done it, but he was too upset to bother or to care. He just needed to get them away from this area. He was not to be the subject of a hunt without a fight. He knew that there was more that he should be thinking about, other than the fact that the pontiff was allied with the baron, and something about Norwood. But at the moment, his mind wouldn't slow enough for him to think. In dwarven fashion, survival mode took over, pushing aside everything that wasn't necessary. It was said in the nations that whatever didn't stay with you when the rush took over wasn't worth worrying about anyway.
I think so.
Is it south?
No, it's northwest.
Then do it, Dave,
Raven said.
We need to move fast. We have become the quarries of a very sickening hunt. Our lives and our souls may depend on speed.
I'll keep that in mind,
Dave promised, looking a little sick, but keeping his tone light. Raven noticed Dave glance over to Shannon, but Shannon was busy destroying the evidence of the camp.
Good,
Raven nodded. He liked the young man, even if he did seem to look up to Shannon as much as the rest of them feared him. Dave didn't get in the way, and when he was involved, he had something to offer. Raven suspected there was more to Dave than anyone had any idea of. He had no doubt that Dave knew more about Shannon than he was telling. He wondered what else Dave hid, but for right now, and as long as Dave was on his side, he wasn't even going to ask. As Raven fell back in the line, the conversation that he had overheard ran through his mind. There were things that he didn't understand, and others he didn't want to. He looked back to Shannon, who had taken up the end position. A fearful chill went through him that seemed to draw the eyes of the man. Raven looked away quickly and followed Tavia, his mouth dry and his thoughts a scramble. It wasn't like him to get upset. He had trained for years to not go into the survival mode, but it failed him tonight. A lot of his training had slipped since he had gotten here. He wasn't sure if it was the pass through the shield or if it was the company. He refused to look at Shannon and kept marching, pushing those in front of him. His faith in the church and the way that it was all progressing had been crumbling for years. Over and over, he had asked himself what it was that his heart rebelled against. Now it was worse. How could God let things get so bad? How could he be true to a faith that let a madman rule it? His stomach rolled and tightened at the thoughts he was having. Fear and repentance rose up in him. Prayers of forgiveness for his weakness of faith replaced thoughts of all else. Dave halted just after sundown, and everyone dropped to the ground. Raven was tired. Normally he could go on for days without stopping, but the shock of what he had seen and overheard last night had drained him. Still, he couldn't sleep. He watched Tavia make a meal of cold meats and dark rye bread for Travis and herself before she joined the others in lying down to sleep. Raven watched Shannon through half-closed eyes, trying to settle his nerves. Shannon was seeing to the ponies. He ran his gloved hands over the weary little animals. Raven wondered if it was fashion that made Shannon wear those gloves, or if he had something to hide. The man wore black, chin to toe, a copy of the cleric's uniform of 1,000 years ago. The clerics had worn green or white in those days, never black. In his youth, Raven had met a few old priests who still had that style in their wardrobes. It was an eerie and unsettling sort of twist on what was once a holy and recognized thing of the church. It was hard not to wonder why Shannon would do that. He had to be well enough educated to know what he was wearing, maybe even old enough to have seen the clerics in those uniforms. Again, 100 questions about the man rose to mind, snuffing each other out until Raven's head ached. The pontiff's words burned in Raven's mind, and that certainly didn't help.
My old partner. Once you have a man in your soul. First man I ever loved.
Those thoughts made him shiver and want to challenge the man in black. As if to stop him from doing anything rash, those thoughts were set aside as he remembered what the pontiff had said of Oirion. Raven looked over at the priest then, feeling a little ill. Oirion was already asleep. He looked younger when he was sleeping, almost innocent and childlike. Oirion was a celebrity in the right groups. He was the grandson of an earl, a wealthy one at that. The idea that Oirion was the bastard son of a convict and a holy man was extreme. Such a thought would not be believed. Raven wondered how a noble's grandson had ended up as a powerful priest, a hunter. That wasn't common. Raven decided that if what he had overheard was the truth, and not a madman's insanity, that Oirion had no idea. Raven was sure that the pontiff would have carefully covered the truth, even from the boy involved. All of a sudden, Raven began to wonder about Oirion, where he had grown up, exactly why he had become a priest, and what his childhood was like. All the questions that he doubted he would ever have answers to. Still, it gave him something to think about besides Shannon or the pontiff. Maybe he had misunderstood, but it was easier on the mind to think of Oirion as the spawn of a corrupt priest and a convict than some of the other things that he could be dwelling on just now. Raven felt a light draw from Dave and looked over at him. Dave sat cross-legged across the camp from Raven, his face relaxed and his mind elsewhere. Curiously, Raven looked at the young man with sight and was surprised. Dave sat in a nimbus of pastel green light. That was the color of elven magic. On top of that, the power cores of the young man glowed faintly behind an ever-cycling shower of blue light. Raven realized with awe that Dave was a rather powerful young man, and that he had some advanced training, some of it on the basis of the priesthood. Before now, the shield he had always worn was undetectable. Now, with the magic he was doing, Dave's shields were visible as his focus and energy went out in search of a new home. Raven wondered if the shield that Dave used was the same type that Shannon wore. His mind found something even easier to think about. Impressed, he let himself wonder where a sailor's son had learned even the rudiments of the magic that was flowing through him. He had the skill of a wizard in his 60s. Dave couldn't be more than 20 at the most. Raven quickly gained a whole new perspective of Dave and had greater respect for him. He also knew that wizardry was all but a crime in most countries, and growing more so. Dave had to know that the priesthood was supposed to remove wizards. They met before they became threats, or to convert them to the priesthood, before they fell to the lust and wilds of their powers. Raven hoped that Oirion didn't see what he saw. He wasn't about to move against Dave, but Oirion was all priest, and he wasn't likely to even hesitate to consider the consequences. Besides, Dave's power couldn't be that bad. It did, after all, seem to be built on the same powers as a hunter or a cleric. The young man could pass for a member of the Sixth. That had to mean something. Thank you for listening. Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this chapter and would like to hear more, please like and subscribe to our channel. It helps more than you know. More chapters are available. Join our Patreon at patreon.com/2ravens801